Okay.
Okay. So thank you all for being here. I told the mayor when I first came in this morning, is a few years ago we did this study of the economic impact of historic preservation in Arkansas and visited a number of towns, and my colleagues Rodney Swink and Caitlin Cotton came here to Batesville, and they just raved about, they loved Arkansas, they loved working in Arkansas, but they raved about Batesville, particularly this theater and the story behind how it came to be, and the Royal on Main Street Hotel that I stayed in last night. So when I both said, I'm speaking at the theater and I'm staying at the hotel, they were thrilled. I've never been in a hotel where the toilet seats were warmed. I mean, this is a pretty fabulous place. So if you ever have a chance to stay at the Royal on Main, please do it. So thanks for having me. This is going to seem like the perpetual economics seminar, so for those of you who doze off, I absolutely understand, it's forgivable, not a problem whatsoever. A few years ago, we did a study in Pennsylvania of their state tax credit, and we were about halfway through the study, and they were having a statewide meeting like this, and their executive director said, Rachel's kind of counterpart in Pennsylvania, said, could you come up and give us just kind of what you've learned so far about the study? So I said, sure, and went up and did it. And so the next day, I got an email address, or email from a participant who said this: I enjoyed your short presentation at the Preservation PA the other afternoon. It was as interesting as the topic would allow. So it's the best I could do is as interesting as the topic would allow, but I thought that was kind of a clever thing to write, so I put it on my Facebook page, this comment, and the following day, I got this. A suggestion from somebody in Pennsylvania about how I might make it more interesting. Well, our design director, Caitlin Cotton, would never let me use it, but I thought it was a good idea. A couple years ago, there had been a series of articles in otherwise really credible publications, including Forbes, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, that were quite critical of historic preservation. And so we just took it on ourselves to kind of respond to that. And based on a lot of the work that we had done, we wrote a short publication just for distribution called 24 Reasons Why Historic Preservation is Good for Your Community. And a lot of those 24 reasons I'll share with you today. Mostly they're based on a series of city studies that we've done in the last few years. Big cities, New York, Los Angeles, Phoenix, San Antonio, some middle-sized cities like Indianapolis and Raleigh, Miami, and then some smaller places like Saratoga Springs, New York, and Cumberland, Maryland. So I pulled some of the factoids we learned in those studies to share with you, but also for this. I pulled some information from the study that we did a few years ago here in Arkansas that specifically looked at the impact of the grants program, of the tax credit program, and as the mayor mentioned, of the wonderful Main Street program here in Arkansas, and I'll share some of those findings as well. So I know that all of you came here for this, so you can look at graphs or charts explaining revealed preference. Well, that's mathematical. I don't know that I explained it. That's mathematically, but I'll show you a different way to understand what revealed preference means. I could ask you, how many of you prefer chocolate ice cream? And a bunch of you would raise your hand. And how many of you prefer vanilla ice cream? And others would raise your hand. Well, that's stated preference. Oh, I like vanilla better, I like chocolate better. But we can understand your preferences in a different way. Is Rachel could come through with a big cart that had some chocolate ice cream cones and some vanilla ice cream cones, and you just take one. Well, you didn't say, I like vanilla better. You took a vanilla cone. And that's what revealed preference is. And so a lot of the work that we do, and you'll see examples of it, are really the marketplace speaking, the marketplace revealing a preference for historic neighborhoods, for historic buildings, for historic character of towns that the mayor was so eloquent about. But we're referred to as a historic preservation firm, but we're in the business of economic development. And in economic development, the first thing is about jobs. And here's just something to stick away in the back of your head. As a general rule of thumb, if you build a new building, half half of that money is going to labor, half of that money is going to materials. But if you do a rehabilitation, 60 to 70% of the money will be in labor, with the balance being in materials. And that has a huge difference in impact on a local economy. That if you think about a sink, you install the sink and that's the end of the line. The sink doesn't spend any more money, but the plumber does. The person who installed the sink does spend more money. He or she takes and joins the YMCA, buys breakfast, gets a haircut. And so this impact, local impact of rehabilitation is significantly greater because of this greater labor intensity of rehabilitation. So we look at jobs in terms of the tax credit here in the state tax credit here in Arkansas. $21 million in tax credit awarded for 342 buildings in 24 cities spurred $224 million in private investment. 10 to 1 is what spurred investment. And it increased the use of the federal tax credit by 58% because you have an effective state tax credit, and that meant jobs. And what it meant was every year since that tax credit was created, an average about 175 direct jobs, and that's the people hammering hammers and nailing nails on the projects, but another 133 jobs indirectly. That think about the person who's selling 2x4s at the lumber yard. He's not working on the project, but the project can't go on if they don't buy that 2x4. So it spurs these indirect jobs as well, and almost as many jobs in indirect and induced jobs as there are in direct jobs. And that means year after year after year, payrolls in Arkansas of almost $5 million. Well, if the governor or the state economic development director or the secretary of commerce said, hey, we're bringing in a business that's going to have a $5 million payroll, they'd have a standing ovation at the state legislature, but that every year after year after year is what the use of the tax credit here in Arkansas means. Every time there's $1 million spent, historic rehabilitation in Arkansas, that means another $700,000 of additional economic activity in Arkansas are spurred. So it's this catalytic impact, economic impact in the state. I got to go back one. Is one of the things that we really loved about the state tax credit program is sometimes the big headlines are about the zillion-dollar hotels that use historic tax credit, but that's not true. That here in Arkansas, in fact, the vast majority of really kind of very modest scale project, kind of mom and pop, the kind of investments up and down the Main Street in Batesville is where the most of that activity in that state tax credit goes. So it really is not for the big guys. It really is one that makes it effective use of the program for little guys. So just in general, in every time there's 100 jobs in new construction in the U.S., 135 jobs are created elsewhere in the economy, but every $100 in rehabilitation creates 186 jobs elsewhere in the economy. So it's this revolving impact on the economy. Every $100 in labor income in new construction creates $145 elsewhere, but $100 in labor income in rehabilitation creates $174. So I don't care if you like gargoyles or cornices. The fact is, if what you're about is jobs, it's rehabilitation, historic buildings that's creating those jobs and those labor income. But it's not just in the construction side of things. This was a study that we did in Los Angeles. So it was a big city, and they don't actually have very many historic districts in commercial areas in Los Angeles. What we call historic districts, they call HPOZs, historic preservation overlay zones, but they're basically the same thing. But the Los Angeles, a vibrant economy. The economy grew, the 15 years we looked at it, the whole economy grew 15% in terms of jobs. In the historic preservation overlay zones grew 25%. In the local and national register districts, 50%. This is revealed preference, that businesses employing those people chose disproportionately to be in historic districts in Los Angeles. In Nashville, again, a hugely vibrant economy, maybe too vibrant for its own good, but a spurring economy. So the historic districts only include 15% of the jobs, but 40% of the job growth took place in historic districts in Nashville. Now, downtown revitalization, and we heard about Main Street here, and I can tell you, I've worked for 35 years in downtown revitalization. I cannot identify a single example of a sustained success story in downtown revitalization where historic preservation wasn't a key component of that effort. Not one. Now, the level of the role that preservation played varies from city to city based on the enlightenment, the leadership, and the local inventory. But look for a city with a very sustained success in downtown revitalization and no historic preservation component, there ain't one. Anyway, the best example of that, of course, is Main Street. It's consciously downtown revitalization based on historic resources. And here in Arkansas, $337 million in the date is 2 years old when we finished the study. $337 million in capital investment in downtowns, 78% of which came from the private sector, 3,900 net new jobs, 1,100 net new businesses, and nearly half of the accredited programs in Arkansas are less than 10,000 people. And as a result, it's spread all over the state, from the far northwest to the far southeast and every place in between in big cities. And there were 2 programs in Little Rock and North Little Rock, and then lots of smaller places as well, including, of course, Batesville. Wonderful. There is no, by the way, there is no economic development program in America that is more cost effective than is Main Street, period, no exceptions. So you can see what happened in terms of Arkansas, in terms of where that dollars come from. Most of it comes from the private sector, although significant public sector investment as well. The value of the volunteer hours, and one of the reasons that Main Street is so successful is it depends on human beings, again, just like the mayor said, of individuals stepping up and saying, my downtown, my historic downtown is important to my community, I'm going to invest my time in that program, and millions of dollars worth of time. But here is this is kind of a geeky measurement, but it's become one of my favorites. Federal government's good for some things, not so good for the other things, but they're great about keeping track of numbers. Right? They keep thousands of numbers to keep track of. One of them is the ratio of businesses that open to businesses that close, right? And on average, over the long term, that ratio is going to be something between 1.1 and 1.2 to 1. That is 11 or 12 businesses open for every 10 that close. And of course, if you're going to have a growing economy, you have to have more businesses opening than closing. So here is the U.S. numbers for 15 years or so. And you can see there's the 1 on the left, and that's 1 would mean exactly the same number of businesses opening and closing. Above 1, more opening than closing. And then you see in the, I don't know if there's a light thing. You see in the middle here where it slopes down, well, that's the middle of the recession. The Great Recession, where more businesses, in fact, closed than opened, so the ratio is under, and then it kind of recovers to kind of normal rate. So that's the U.S. numbers. Here is the numbers for Arkansas. Pretty similar pattern. Few years Arkansas does better than the country as a whole. A few years does a little less, but largely the same pattern of opening and closing. That is Arkansas Main Street communities. Every year in the depths of the recession. It's not like they didn't have that they didn't have bad years, but never were there more businesses closing than opening. So this is the story of how historic preservation-based economic development strategy works. It works, and this is a kind of great example of that. But we look at, especially because I have young, brilliant people who think of things that I don't look at. We always look for kind of new ways to look at things. When we did a study in Raleigh, we decided to use Yelp and say, where are the favorite restaurants? Well, disproportionately, the favorite restaurants were in historic buildings in Raleigh. And then we look, here's another vibrant economy and a vibrant downtown, but where did the new businesses start up? Where did they go to in downtown? Disproportionately into historic buildings. Almost half of the startup businesses in Raleigh, in fact, were in historic buildings, and another almost a quarter were in buildings that were old, just weren't designated historic yet. Then the impact of grants programs. And again, we were fortunate here in Arkansas that the State Historic Preservation Office has lots of great grant programs and wanted us to look at the effectiveness of those. And since 1971, so 30, 50 years worth of grants, 2,400 grants in 170 cities in Arkansas, 74 of the 75 counties in Arkansas, 55 million, 45% of which was used for, bricks and mortar stuff on real buildings, on a whole range of kind of activities. One of our favorites was the Courthouse grant program. Some of these were small, some of them larger, average only $50,000, so you can't rehabilitate a whole courthouse for that. But really, the courthouse is the one place, it's almost every place, where people, it's this kind of physical expression of democracy. They're grand, way grander than they need to be to house the county judge and the assessor's office. But they really were, and think about what the people thought about in 1890 or 1880 or 1920 when they built their courthouse. Those county commissioners knew that they would be dead before the use of that courthouse was gone. And it was that future commitment to their community that they spent taxpayers' dollars, and there wasn't a bunch of dollars. They spent those dollars on good buildings because of that, what that courthouse represents. And so this great courthouse grant program that the State Preservation Office has. And then I love one of the most innovative preservation funding mechanisms in America is this use of a part of the real estate transfer tax to go to historic preservation. Arkansas is way ahead of the curve in thinking about that as a funding mechanism, and it means it's volatile. That when there's no real estate depressions, there's not much money coming in, so it goes up and down. But at least there's this ongoing fund to dedicate to historic preservation. It's just a brilliant approach. So we looked at these three programs. We looked at Main Street, we looked at the tax credit program, we looked at the grants program, and kind of reached some conclusions. All three of those sets of tools reinforce each other. They're kind of not in isolation. They often work together. There's great geographical distribution around this physically large state. It has this designated funding source from the tax, the real estate transfer tax. And then this kind of concept of working together. It really is the public, private, and nonprofit sector, state and local governments, which don't always work together, and citizens and property owners and businesses. So it's this working together pattern that Arkansas is really known for. And it's this issue about long-term commitment to historic preservation and to the historic resources in Arkansas. So we were just thrilled to have the chance to do this study, and I think it was a great measure of the success here in Arkansas. And then, of course, it demonstrated the economic benefit of those efforts. Then heritage tourism. Now, let me make sure I'm understood. I have a goal in life, and I'm really old, so I've got to reach it pretty quick. But it's when you say historic preservation and economics in the same sentence that the automatic response isn't, oh, you must mean heritage tourism. Yes, it's important, and I'll give you some examples of that, but there's just such a wide range of ways that historic preservation adds to the local economy. It doesn't have anything to do with tourism. Having said that, heritage tourism is important. Here is San Antonio, again with Alamo and one of the most recent listings, I think 3 years ago, on the World Heritage List are the 6 or 7 Spanish missions in San Antonio. So about slightly over half of their overnight visitors we fall into the category of heritage visitors. Almost half of the day visitors fall in that category. And when you go on vacation, you basically spend all of your money in 5 areas. You spend it on lodging, you spend it on food and beverage, you spend it on local transportation, and that's important. I flew out here from Washington, but Arkansas didn't benefit from that plane ticket, so that didn't hurt. But I rented a car in Little Rock and drove here. That's local transportation. That is an Arkansas benefit. So food, beverage, lodging, local transportation, retail purchases, and then recreation. That is kind of everything else. Going to the theater, visiting historic site, whatever the rest of those are. Not only do historic visitors, heritage visitors, spend more on their trip, they spend more in every one of those categories than people who go to visit someplace and say, yeah, historic stuff, I don't care anything about that. In Nashville, again, I apologize for the kind of preservation geek talk for a moment, But in the preservation circles, we talk about tangible heritage. So that's this building, tangible heritage, we can touch it. But there's also intangible heritage, kind of traditions, patterns, the showing. This is a tangible heritage, but showing these 11 Christmas movies every year for the community at this theater, that's an intangible heritage. That will become a tradition here. Well, in Nashville, of course, one of the great music centers in all of the world, their biggest intangible heritage is the music. But what we found in Nashville is that disproportionately, those music venues and the people who came to visit for heritage reasons, attachment to music, there's this strong connection between the built heritage, the tangible heritage of historic buildings, and the intangible heritage of music. So people who are heritage visitors went to more music venues. They visited more places. They stayed longer. They were more likely to bring their kids along, the heritage visitors, than people for some other reason. So this intimate connection in Nashville, between the tangible and the intangible heritage. Now, we might not think of Pittsburgh as a great heritage city, although if you haven't been there in the last 15 or 20 years, go there. It's one of the great comeback city stories in America. But just the heritage portion of their tourism, $800 million a year, being distributed around all of those 4 areas. Rhode Island, we did a statewide study and looked at the historic preservation there. Well, the biggest thing that people did in Rhode Island when they were tourists, they shopped. But that's true of all of us. We might not spend most of our money on shopping, but none of us goes on vacation, doesn't buy. So that's most common activity. And then fine dining, we all want to go out to eat. And then it is by the way, we did the Yelp thing, 16 of 25 of the favorite restaurants in Rhode Island, in fact, were historic buildings. Then, it's the ocean state, so no surprise that beach going was next. And then landmark historic sites was the next most active thing, and everything else kind of fell after that. But again, just the heritage portion of the tourism. $326 million in lodging, $166 million in local transportation. So $1.3 billion just in the heritage portion of Rhode Island's tourism industry. A few years ago, I read about a study in Norway, and it said only 6 to 10% of the heritage visitors' expenditures are made at the heritage site they went to visit. So I thought, that's really interesting. I want to experiment with that in the U.S. So we did a study in Utah with virtually the same findings. So Utah is a big state, has one big city in the middle, Salt Lake, but then little towns all over filled with historic resources. Often to those places, it is the historic site that draws the visitors, but it's not the historic site that gets the benefit. So in Utah, is virtually the same number. Less than 7% of the heritage visitors' expenditure was on the site that they went to visit. 93% was on the rental car they took to get there, the gas station, the retail purchases, and other things. The historic site was the magnet, but everybody else was the beneficiary. So those of you who are involved with historic sites in Arkansas, keep that in mind. You might go to the city council and say, hey, can you help us out so we can make sure the light bills get paid this year? And some council member, one of the 3 on the 5-3 vote in creating the historic district, will say, well, you guys don't even pay your own way. Why should we be subsidizing you? Well, but here's the reason, is that you're not the one getting the money. You're bringing people to town, but it's the gas station, the restaurant, the hotel, the retail shops that, in fact, are getting that customer's money, that visitor's money. And in Arkansas, so in Utah, where did it go? $186 million in lodging from heritage visitors, $115 million to restaurants from heritage visitors, and the entertainment in which all visitation, that's only $54 million of the whole that went to the heritage sites and everything else in that category, the rest of the marketplace achieving the rest of it. Then the issue about property values. This is a really interesting one, because when I first started doing this kind of analysis 30 years ago or 35 years ago, often there was great resistance to creating local historic districts particularly frankly, from the real estate community, and I'm not anti-real estate community, that's where I come from, but often saying, yeah, one more layer of regulation, and it's going to do nothing but hurt property values. That was a consistent answer. Well, every study, virtually every study over the last 30 years has shown the opposite. So it's Savannah, and the four local historic districts. Savannah, of course, one of the great places in the world. And we looked at between 1999 and 2014, and those years are important because the end of the 90s and the early of 21st century, real estate values going up on kind of like a cocaine-driven lunacy, and then a big crash, and then a recovery. And this time period covers all three of those phases. Every one of Savannah's historic districts outperformed the rest of the city, every one of them. Now, some of these are very rich ones. The Victorian district, now it's a pretty wealthy district, but Collier-Brownsville is kind of opposite of a wealthy district. Didn't matter. Every historic district outperformed the city as a whole. Here is San Antonio. And San Antonio has what we ordinarily think of as historic districts. They also have a thing called conservation districts. They're also meant to kind of preserve the character of the neighborhood, but kind of less stringent design requirements, both of which outperform the city as a whole over the same kind of up and down time frame. Those that did the best were the ones that had the local historic districts. The ones that did the second best were those in the conservation districts, both of which did better than the city as a whole. Now, some of you I know will probably sit on local preservation commissions. I hate to tell you, but nobody is paying a premium for properties in historic districts for the right to appear before your goofy commission. They're paying a premium for the confidence that the lunatic across the street can't be doing something to his house that's going to have an adverse impact on the value of mine. That old cliche in real estate that the three most important things are, you all know what they are, location, location, location. But that has real economic impact, is that the value of real estate does not come from four walls and a roof. The value of real estate comes from its context. And the economic role of historic districts is to protect the context within which the individual properties lie. And that's why there is a premium. It's this location. Every week, and before we had 2 years of the plague, but every week I'd be someplace, and I'd be driven around some great neighborhood, and they'd point to a wonderful Victorian house and say, yeah, if that house were in Washington where you live, it'd be worth $4 million. Well, yeah, but it ain't. Real estate has its value based on its context and its location. And that's the economic role of historic districts, is to protect that context. In Saratoga Springs, a smaller place in upstate New York, well, again, pretty wealthy, at least in the summertime, they make horse racing stuff. But there the study was almost exclusively on property values. That's all they wanted us to look at. So we looked at it in every way we could think of. We looked at average value in historic districts and non-historic districts. We looked at the average house value per square foot, historic districts, not historic districts. We looked at the value of pre-1990, 1900 to 1925, 1926 to 1950, 1951 to 1975, but by age. Every case, the historic properties in historic districts were worth more. We're just finishing a study in Portland, Maine, where we looked at this age thing with the same answer. We looked at Victorian. Okay, maybe people just like Victorian houses. Okay, Victorian houses in historic districts were worth more than Victorian houses not in historic districts. Properties that were in excellent condition were worth more in historic districts than not. Properties in normal condition were worth more in historic districts than otherwise. So it is this positive impact of historic districts. And it has this parallel that people ought to be paying attention to. Here we had the great real estate crash where millions of Americans lost everything they had. Millions. For most of the vast majority of us, most of our assets, such as they are in the home we own. And millions of people were wiped out in that for all kinds of reasons. But here's the pattern. Every place we've looked, and now we've probably looked at 40 cities, every place we looked, that the rates of foreclosure were lower in historic districts than the rest of the city. This is in Raleigh. Almost 1 in 10 properties in Raleigh went under some kind of foreclosure action. Half that many in National Register districts, and half of that number in local historic districts. Here is San Antonio. Every single historic district had lower foreclosure rates than did the city as a whole. Here is Pittsburgh. Local districts, National Register districts, a much lower rate of foreclosures than the rest of the city. Now, it's not that people who live in historic districts never get fired, never run their credit card bills up too much, never get divorced. I think it's this, is that there's such a strong latent demand for properties in historic districts that even in down times, if I get myself in financial trouble, I can get that property sold before it reaches that foreclosure stage. That strong market even in down times. Somebody ought to be paying attention. Is the HUD, FHA, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the American Bankers Association ought to be paying attention if there's a lower rate of foreclosures. And I'm promising you in the next 18 months we're going to see a renewal of the foreclosures. That there's a lower rate in historic districts than the rest of the city. Doesn't have anything to do with gargoyles and cornices. It has to do with the contributions to the economy of the historic districts. And then also parallel, the strength in up and down markets. I'm thrilled that my former colleague, Ree Korsicki, is going to be out here speaking in August because she's just fabulous. She's one of my favorite people in the world. And she now lives in Savannah. She and I did a study in Savannah a few years ago. In up markets, the historic districts did better. In down markets, the decline started later. Not that they didn't ever go down in value, they did, but the decline started later. It stabilized sooner. The recovery began sooner than in the rest of the city. Now, I'm a market economy guy. I'm a believer, but what I'm really a believer in, General Motors and Microsoft takes care of themselves. I care about small businesses. And so this relationship, this revealed preference of small businesses to be in historic districts is something I care about. So here is Saratoga Springs again, is that the historic districts contain 22% of all jobs, but 31% of the small jobs, small firm jobs, and 46% of the young jobs, younger businesses getting started. This again is San Antonio. The purple areas are local historic districts. The green circles are jobs, concentration of jobs in small businesses. So the larger the circle, the more jobs in small businesses are in that area. And it's not that they're all in historic districts, but there's this pattern of clustering. You want to be close to where those historic districts are. And then the startup and young businesses. So here again is Los Angeles. Not many commercial districts are historic districts in Los Angeles for a variety of reasons. In fact, and only 1.8% of all the jobs in LA are in historic districts, but 4% of the startup businesses, jobs in startup businesses, are in historic districts. A revealed preference for startup businesses to locate in those historic districts. Nashville, again, 3% of all jobs, but 11% of job growth, 13% of startup jobs, 15% of small business jobs in historic districts in this vibrant economy in Nashville. Manhattan, kind of the other end of the spectrum in terms of things, and wacko economy and crazy winds. 12% of all of the jobs are in historic districts in Manhattan. 18% of startup jobs, jobs at startup businesses, 18% of jobs in young businesses in historic districts. And by the way, in Manhattan, as expensive it is, a disproportionate share of African American owned jobs and of women owned jobs, greater share in historic districts than in the rest of the city. This issue about the pull, particularly for the knowledge-based workers and creative class workers, revealing their preference to be in a historic district. Here is the whole state of Rhode Island. 3%, 4% of the jobs are in a historic district. But in professional, scientific, and technical services, educational services, other services, management of companies and enterprises, arts and entertainment and recreation, the kind of knowledge work and creative class workers disproportionately choose to be in historic districts. And again, New York City, 12.5% of all jobs, 16% of information jobs, 21% of educational services, and look at this one, 23% of those creative class. You can love New York, you can hate it, but nobody can say it's not one of the most creative cities in the world, and yet almost a quarter of the arts and entertainment, the creative class jobs are in historic districts. Here is Indianapolis. Well, Indianapolis is not New York, but in fact, again, this all jobs and these knowledge worker jobs choosing to be in historic districts. Then millennial. How many of you are millennials? Raise your hand if you're millennial. Well, I hate millennials. Actually, anybody born before 1970, I hate you. You're just too young. I don't care. But there's this pattern of patterns of millennials. Here is Los Angeles, the Los Angeles study, where we looked at where people lived by age, and the line is almost parallel every place except there. In the millennials, who have a greater share in historic districts than they do in the city as a whole. And this is, here's Nashville, where us baby boomers, about the same share of us live in historic districts, live everywhere else. Millennials, disproportionate choice to be in historic districts. And then this we've stolen from the National Association of Realtors that does a real good job of tracking who the buyers are of housing. And the last study they did based on age, that millennials were 34% of all buyers of houses, but they were 59% of the buyers of pre-1912 houses and 44% of buyers of the houses built between 1912 and 1960. I think it's the 3 C's that are driving millennials to make those choices. Character, convenience, because those historic districts are often near the center of town, and cost. There's often cost competitive that older housing that they can buy, and those 3 C's are showing this in choice of millennials to buy in older and historic neighborhoods. And it reflects in young workers, disproportionately again being in historic neighborhoods and downtowns. Walkability and bikeability. I'm sure you all know this, but there's a thing called walkscore.com. Go on your computer, go walkscore.com, type in any address in America, and you'll get a score from 1 to 100. Higher the score, the more walkable it is. And walkability has become a really driving force for lenders, for real estate agents, for builders, all kinds of people, because people are showing a preference for walkability. And part of, I think, this premium attached to historic neighborhoods is, as you will see, historic neighborhoods are more walkable. So here is Savannah, great, design city, designed for walkability. Every historic district, except barring one, has a higher walk score than does the rest of the city. And again, the rest of the city, we only talk about the residential areas of the rest of the city. It'd be unfair if we said, oh, here's the industrial park. Well, of course, that wouldn't be walkable. It's not supposed to be. So other residential areas. Here is a Raleigh that as a city is very car dependent. It's a walk score of 29. Local historic districts, walk score of 82. National Register District score of 64. Here is Nashville. Every single historic district, higher walk score than the city as a whole. And then bike scores. Now Pittsburgh is a lot of up and down stuff, but the bike score better in historic districts than the city as a whole. In Indianapolis, that the share of the population close to a bike trail, almost 40% of the people living in historic districts, this proximity thing. So it's not all about the design of those neighborhoods, it's where they're located, how they're grouped, their density, all of those things that add to this. And then this issue of density, that's a real challenging one. Because if you have a public, you fill the Melba Theater with the 410 citizens of Batesville and said, we want to talk about density. Almost everybody in the audience would say, yeah, density stuff. I don't want density. If I wanted to live in density, I'd go to Chicago or New York. I don't like density. Here's what historic means. But I'll make the argument for density, for things like effectiveness of police patrols, of water and sewer, of public transportation, of all kinds of things. We need density for that stuff to be cost effective. But nobody likes it. Nobody but planners like it. Citizens don't like density, except for this. is that what we have in historic districts is density at a human scale. So here is Indianapolis, where the density in the historic districts half again as much as it is in the rest of the city. Here's Los Angeles, a notoriously low density place. Density in historic districts twice of what it is in the rest of it. And nobody argues about that bungalow being, oh, I don't want density because I don't want a place like that across the street. No. People say, that's exact, I don't want density, I want that. Well, what that is, in fact, is dense neighborhoods. Here's Raleigh. And a favorite, I kind of come from the political perspective that we ought to be frugal with taxpayers' dollars. You can agree or disagree, that's just my perspective. But here is Raleigh. So at the beginning of the 20th century, they had a population approaching 8,000 people per square mile, and then it fell dramatically with suburbanization, automobile, fell a lot. And so the density now in the city as a whole, about 2,500 people, about 40% of what it was at the beginning of the 20th century. Historic districts density twice that amount. Historic districts provide density without having 40-story condominiums to provide it. And it happens place after place. Now, Mike Bree, Grosicki, so you can ask when you go to listen to her, you can ask her about this. When we were working in Raleigh, I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find me two neighborhoods about the same geographical size. And then the only other difference, I want one in a newer neighborhood and one in an older neighborhood, and let's look at the difference. So she said, great, and she got this. So she got Oakwood, which is a historic neighborhood, and Reedham Oaks, Wyndham. So population, 1,700 in Oakwood, 500 in Reedham Oaks. Size in acres, both of them the same size, 114 acres. Housing units, about 800 in Oakwood, 127 in Reedham Oaks. And then average year of construction, 1925 versus 1919. So there you see the neighborhoods. And then we started making the calculations. So average size per square foot, 2,500 versus 3,500. Okay, some people want a larger house, nothing wrong with that. Average value of the house, 315,000 versus 524. And this is where the city finance officer gets a little premature in his judgments, saying, oh yeah, see, that's why we want that new neighborhood. We're getting, okay, just chill for a minute. Taxes per unit, 2,800 versus 48. Now he's reinforced in his belief. See, that's why we want them. It's all that extra money. Okay. Population per acre, 14.5 versus 4. Now, roads. Even if the developer puts in the roads initially, that is a permanent obligation of the city to maintain. So square feet of roads per unit, 1,000 versus 2,200. Taxes per acre, 22,000 versus 5,000. Sooner or later, the water and sewer line is going to have to be replaced. It's going to be 8,800 for the historic district. It's going to be 24,000 for the new neighborhood. Annual property taxes coming from the neighborhoods, 2.3 million versus 610,000. Who's the fiscally responsible one in that scenario? It's where you have that human scale density in those historic neighborhoods. Then this issue that's more and more important in many places, and that's environmental responsibility. So we looked at in Phoenix, again, a place in the middle of the desert that's trying to survive. We looked at the greenhouse gas benefits because historic neighborhoods, even a place like Phoenix, tend to be more tree or older. The trees have grown or they've been planted or whatever. And so the CO2 emissions, the gallons of water saved because of the cover in those historic neighborhoods. We looked at this issue of throwing stuff away, which is increasingly expensive in both dollars and environmental quality. So you tear down in LA, a 2,000 square foot house generates 295 cubic yards of debris, 84 tons of stuff going into the landfill. And then we, in Rhode Island, where they have one landfill in a small state and it's over capacity now, so they got to do something. So we looked at this wonderful building in downtown Providence and said, all right, what if instead of rehabbing that building, they had built a new building at the edge of town, same size, so same function. What are the environmental differences? Well, a difference in 158,000 to 211,000 in vehicle miles traveled, lower CO2 emissions, taking 24 to 28 cars off the road, retained embodied energy, 4 acres of greenfield preserved because you used the existing building, 2,000 tons of stuff not going to the landfill that otherwise would have. Infrastructure saved, infrastructure investment saved of 400,000 to 640,000. I don't care if you're the save taxes at all cost constituency or you're the green boat people. You ought to be holding hands leading the preservation parade, because whether your issue is fiscal responsibility or the environment, either way, preservation is a more responsible action to be taken. When we did the study in Utah, we recruited a guy, a friend of mine, professor at University of Utah, engineering type, who made these calculations, and he used this materials flow. We build a building, we got to get something out of the ground or out of the forest. We got to convert it into a material. We got to haul the material to the site. We have to incorporate it to build the building, and you use it for so many years, and then something happens. You throw it away or you build it. So this kind of materials flow calculations. And he made it on a modestly sized house in Salt Lake of this total materials flow. If we rehabilitate it, no, we can't have buildings where we're freezing to death, so we need to update the systems. No question about that in historic preservation. Or we go outside and build new construction, and not some McMansion, just the same size of house, or we tear down the existing house and infill 3, 4, 5 times as much materials flow cost in those. That's where environmental responsibility comes in. New York City. When Bloomberg was mayor of New York, he wanted to put the city on the path to be the most environmentally responsible city in the world. Good businessman that he is, he said, step one, we got to figure out where we're using energy today. Wasn't anything to do with historic preservation, saying we got to be energy efficient, how do we do it? So he commissioned this massive survey of energy use of residential and commercial buildings throughout New York City. Well, contrary to what, frankly, environmentalists have been telling us for years, oh, you got to get rid of those old buildings, they're big energy hogs and blah, 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 blah. The opposite was true. In fact, the older the building, the less consumption of energy that was used. The green gizmo buildings wasn't the answer. In fact, it was the older buildings doing it. In Miami-Dade County, we looked at tree canopy in the historic districts. And then this issue about smart growth, about being comprehensively responsible. And I've always liked smart growth because it has this very specific set of criteria that means smart growth. Mixed land uses, compact building design, range of housing choices, walkable neighborhood, and so forth. That's their list. So we looked at things like, one on the list is compact building design. So we looked at the average size of houses in historic districts in Raleigh. We looked in Los Angeles. This is about mixed land use, where in the non-historic districts, about 85% of it was single-family residents, where in historic districts, only a third was single-family residents, with lots of duplexes, threeplexes, fourplexes, so a mix of housing types. Miami-Dade County, we looked at distance to commute. All of these are smart growth criteria, better in historic districts. And so really, if you did nothing in your city, but make sure that historic neighborhoods were preserved, you would have advanced every one of the smart growth principles. Neighborhood level diversity. You don't have to agree with this. We kind of think, we as a firm, think it's just healthy to have at the neighborhood level a demographic diversity that's reflected of whatever the demographic diversity is in the city as a whole. We just think that's healthy. And so we look at it. And so here is Indianapolis. There are various historic neighborhoods and the city as a whole by race. And the horizontal blue line is the kind of percentage of white population in Indianapolis. Well, you can see there's some that are skewed a bit, where there's significantly more white, in some cases significantly more black. But the fact is that overall, it's a pretty good reflection of the population as a whole. Here is in Los Angeles. Who lives in historic neighborhoods in Los Angeles? Well, the other, and that's Asian Pacific, Native American categories of things, Asian and black populations have a greater representation in historic districts than they do in the city as a whole. The only ones that are kind of underrepresented relative to the overall population in historic districts is white people. Same is true in Los Angeles in Latina community. Greater share in historic districts than the city as a whole. That's increasingly Latin community. In parallel to diversity by race is diversity by income. We also think it's just healthy to have rich people living next to poor people. We just think that's good. And when my colleagues first did the analysis, I thought they'd made up the numbers because they're too perfect. That the distribution of income in the whole state of Rhode Island virtually the same as the income distribution in the rest of the state. And in Rhode Island, which is not a particularly diverse state racially, but again, the racial distribution is about the same in historic districts as in the state as a whole. In San Antonio, where there's not a large black population, but a very large Hispanic population, it's a majority Hispanic city. In fact, who lives in historic districts is almost to the decimal point who lives in historic districts in the city. This is income in Phoenix. Again, it's largely parallel in historic districts to the city as a whole. Then an issue increasingly important almost every place in the country, and that's the issue of housing affordability. And oftentimes historic districts are being a villain in this. Oh, your historic districts are keeping us from having affordable housing. So here is Miami, housing cost burden, and that's when people are paying more than 35% of their income on housing costs. A lower share of homeowners and renters in historic districts are housing cost burden than the city as a whole. Here is Los Angeles. Again, when transportation is added in, which is an important component of this affordability, a person's better off, however bad it is, better off in historic districts than the overall city. And then this issue about gentrification. Oh, especially in bigger cities. Oh, gentrification, all those historic districts are doing is gentrifying the neighborhoods. Well, in Los Angeles, people way smaller than we are at the University of UCLA and USC did a gentrification study. And they looked for a 15-year period of where the gentrification was taking place in Los Angeles, and those are the orange areas on the map. We took their map and we overlaid it with where the local historic districts are, and that's the blue areas. Almost no connection. Almost no connection. Wasn't that gentrification didn't take place in Los Angeles? It did. Didn't take place in historic districts. About 8% of the areas that were identified as gentrifying were in historic districts, and about 5% of the historic districts were in gentrifying areas. It's just not a correlation whatsoever. It's not that gentrification doesn't happen. It's not a challenge. It's that it's not historic districts that are causing that effect. I live in Washington, D.C., and a lot of cities in the east and the northeast have lost population over the last 50 years. So I'm really interested in what happens when those cities turn the corner and start growing again. Well, as Rachel mentioned, I teach at the University of Pennsylvania in the spring, and I go up every Tuesday on the train, but I really don't know the city very well. But I remember reading the headlines when the 2010 census comes out. Big celebration. After 50 years of losing population, we haven't grown much, but we started to grow again greatly. And it was good news, except that they were wrong. The historic districts grew by 12,000 people. The rest of the city still lost population. When the growth begins to change, take place again, it happens first in those historic districts. Here's where I live, in Washington, D.C. Again, a city that lost population for 50 years. Between 2000 and 2010 began to grow again, disproportionate share of that growth in historic districts. Here's Boston, who turned the corner a decade earlier than Washington and Philadelphia. Again, a greater share going into historic districts than elsewhere in the city. There are attractors of growth. Historic districts attract growth. So here's the population growth in a fast-growing place like Miami, growing more in historic districts than the rest of the county. In Rhode Island, the whole state is pretty flat in terms of population growth. It's very not growing, but virtually, over half of the growth that has taken place in historic districts. People revealing their choice to live in those neighborhoods. Population growth, this is Indianapolis. This is in Pittsburgh. In spite of its kind of recovery, still losing population, but not in historic districts. Historic preservation allows cities to evolve, allows them to change. It doesn't freeze them as museums over time. In Savannah, one of the great historic cities in America, in fact, more money invested in new construction in historic districts than rehabilitation in historic districts, allowing the city to evolve. This is Los Angeles, the same pattern of rehabilitation and new construction. Now, for those of you who are elected officials, tax generation is important. You gotta have taxes to fix potholes, pay cops and teachers. So here is the value in local taxes. Local government's driven, as you all know, to a large extent by property tax revenues. Well, the value per acre, which reflects the tax collections, twice as high in Saratoga Springs in historic districts. Value per acre in Miami is 3 times as much as the rest of the city. Value in Indianapolis, 4 times as much in historic districts than the rest of the area. But sometimes this issue about gentrification, displacement, it doesn't mean they're not real, but sometimes it comes to the forefront and historic districts are being the villain. So we took, in Savannah, we took not all of the taxes paid in the historic districts, just the taxes attributable to their greater rates of appreciation than the rest of the city. Just that incremental difference. The taxes that the city, county, and school district, from that incremental difference in value change, amounts to $3 million, $3.5 million for the school district, $3 million for the city, $3 million for the county. That means just that incremental taxes from that increased pace of appreciation means the school district could pay 86 teachers, that the county could pay a quarter of the entire budget of the sheriff's office, that the city, if there's a problem with affordability, could subsidize housing $200 a month for 1,300 families. So it's not that there's something bad's happening, is that there's a consequence that allows more money for vital public services. Preservation often serves as a catalyst. Some of you probably know Baton Rouge. And for years, the kind of downtown of Baton Rouge was really a dead place. Until they started with using the state tax credit. Now the main core street, mostly on small project, the most vibrant part of the city. We did a study in Louisiana, and one of my favorite examples was this one, Rouse's Market, a 1950s automobile dealership that was converted to a grocery store. Nothing. You can see from 2004 to 2012, nothing happened in the neighborhood. Nothing. Katrina to then, nothing happened until Rouse's Market took place, and then $128 million worth of investment, almost in new construction, because it was in vacant lots around it. And we talked to all the developers. Why did you develop here? Because of Rouse's Market. Rouse's Market happened because there were tax credits for historic building. SCAD in Savannah, we looked at where Savannah had invested in buildings, the change in values around them. This is one of my favorite examples. In Baltimore, in inner city Baltimore, an industrial building turned into housing targeted toward teachers and public employees. Change in population up, building permits up, where in the rest of the city, both of those things were down. Homes of social and cultural institutions tend to be in historic districts in San Antonio, in Nashville. And then this issue about neighborhood stability, tough one to measure. So we kind of looked for alternative measures. So we looked at the rate of turnover of renters. They're likely to be longer in tenure in historic districts than other places in the city. That was Los Angeles. In Indianapolis, there's an Adopt a Block program where people, it really is kind of a program to address your immediate neighborhood. Significantly greater share of those in historic districts than in the city as a whole. Vacancies, which is for many new cities may be an issue, it isn't, certainly is in Little Rock. We looked at office vacancy in Los Angeles, office vacancy of the loft and creative buildings. We looked at residential vacancy in Indianapolis, all of which are decidedly lower in historic districts. And then this issue about all those stupid historic preservation commissions, all they want to do, they're just in business to tell people no. Well, it's just not the case. Here's Indianapolis. We looked at 20 years or so of their applications. 1% were denied. 60% were approved at the staff level, didn't have to appear before the commission. Here is Raleigh with the same kind of numbers. 95, 96, 94% approval year after year after year. New York Landmarks Commission, hey, New York, a big overregulated place, blah, blah, blah. But again, you're more likely to die by be hit by a cab in New York City than you are to have your preservation application denied. And then in this issue about coverage, you're covering our whole city. You can't do anything because there's stupid historic district. Here is the coverage in Indianapolis, about 4% of the land area. By 3% in parcels and 5% in parcels and 3% in land area. Even in Los Angeles, it's about 5% that are under the purview of the Landmarks Commission. In New York City, which is where the real estate industry is trying to get rid of historic districts, saying you've frozen the whole city. Not at all the case, but they're about, over the citywide, about 5% of the land is under the purview of the Landmarks Commission. So I want to finish with the economist who actually knew what he's talking about, a great Harvard economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, and this is what he wrote. The preservation movement has one great curiosity. There is never retrospective controversy or regret. Preservationists are the only people in the world who are invariably confirmed in their wisdom after the fact. Well, that's you all. Congratulations. And I put at the bottom both the study from here in Arkansas and the study on the 24 reasons if you want to take a look. So thanks very much, and we have 2 minutes for questions, right, Rachel?
We've got however much time we need for questions. I'll bring you a microphone if you have questions for Donovan so that everyone can hear. Does anyone have questions? So
question, comment, alternative view, or go back to Washington, you communist, any of those are perfectly acceptable.
Hello, sir. Marshall Ray from Jacksonville, Arkansas. Also born and raised in Indianapolis. I was really impressed with what you presented there. My primary interest is workforce development in the building trades. And although these jobs are created, we're having a disconnect in the ability to supply those needs. So if you have any insight into that, I'd like to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, the question was largely about the building trades. This is all well and good, but if we don't have the human beings to do the work, this in the end can't happen. I should reward you here I'll give you $1 when I'm leaving here. We just finished, and it's probably going to be published within the next 2 weeks, a study for an organization called the Campaign for Historic Trades that really is looking at that shortfall. And you're statistically correct, is that there is both a strong demand for the work, both the work now and the work projected to be in the future, and a real shortfall of supply of workers. And it really needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed formally. Covington, Kentucky, we did another trade study for Covington, because they're starting their own kind of trade school for the heritage trades, recognizing that shortfall. And here's the issue. They're good jobs, they're well-paid jobs, they're stable jobs, and they're stable jobs into the future, but we don't have enough human beings to fill them. And so it's a great opportunity. And in Covington, they are specifically targeting their training program to kind of unemployed or underemployed parts of the community. So women, minorities, immigrants, young graduates. And because they're good jobs, good paying, household support, living wage jobs, and not enough people to fill them. So you're absolutely right, there's a need, and if we're going to keep fixing up historic buildings, we need people who don't muck them up because they don't have the skills. And across the board, we had kind of lots of survey data among professionals in the field. Across the board, they say we pay a premium if somebody has experience in this area. We're suffering shortfalls, and we've broken it down by about 10 trades, so you can specifically see, but you're absolutely right, and it's a critical issue.
I'd like to just say that I've done some pretty extensive research into the wage grades.
Use the microphone so we can hear you. Hold it up close.
Okay, there you go. I found in my studies and research that a historic preservation employee, carpenter, mason, on average, is paid 56% more than the regular craftsman outside the historic district.
Yeah, yeah. Well, see, that's motivation. So we just need to get to particularly young people and unemployed people and say, this is an opportunity for you. You're absolutely right. And we need you. We need you. We need you to know what you're doing. So you're absolutely correct.
Any other questions for Donovan?
Donovan, I have one question for you. What are the units for energy intensity in a building? Is it like something like kilowatt hours per square foot, or is that what you mean by energy intensity?
Yeah, good point. I think in the New York study, they used the exactly that. They used the consumption of energy per square foot as their base measure. Yes, sir. I think and it's not an area where I have expertise. I think there are some alternative measures, but I think for the one that I cited, that was the measure they used.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hello, everybody. My name's Bob Harris. I'm from Centerton, Arkansas, and my addiction is the preservation of my grandparents' house in Centerton. Centerton's a small town just west of the future megapolis of Bentonville. And I have a question about who's in the audience. And I've introduced myself. I'm just somebody who decided to take on the restoration of a 120-year-old house, brick, it's all brick. But I was also interested in who might be getting anything out of this presentation. I think it's a great presentation for, say, grant writers maybe, or city planners, or bankers, or let's see, I'm a property owner in that category as part of preservation. Who else is just a person who's involved with restoring a project?
Great. That's a great. So this is a great idea. Let's do it. And you can answer. You may fall in more than one category. How many of you own historic property? Ooh, look, fabulous, fabulous. How many of you work for local or state government? Great. Okay. How many? Any bankers? Great. Wonderful. Any architects, design professionals, landscape architects, others? Who else was on your list?
Oh, that covers everybody, I think. Constructors, contractors.
In contractors, yeah. Great. Okay.
Okay. Great.
Good. So Rachel, good job of getting a diverse audience. So, okay. And thanks for raising that question. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Donovan, and thank you all. We're going to take a short break, so y'all go out, help yourself to refreshments. There's coffee, water, sodas, and some snacks. Help yourself, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Thank you for raising that question. Thank you. You know, if you will email me, as soon as that trade study is out, I'll be happy to connect you.
You're gonna stay for the day?
I'm going to go and check on my hotel, and then I'll be back. So, and I don't have with me. I'll bring a card.